Welcome to our tutorial on lazy loading with custom hooks in Next.js apps. Let's get started by importing the useState and useEffect hooks from React, which we'll use to manage state and side effects. Here we're defining our custom hook, useLazyLoad. It accepts a fetch function, which should be a function that returns a promise, as well as an optional dependence array that will contain any dependencies that the useEffect hook relies on to rerun. We initiate a data state with useState, setting the initial value to null. This state will later store the data fetched by the fetch function. Next, we create a loading state that signifies whether the data is currently being fetched. We initialize it to false. We also maintain an error state to capture any errors from the fetch function. Initially, this is set to null. Now, let's utilize the useEffect hook, which will handle the side effect of fetching the data asynchronously. Inside useEffect, we immediately set loading to true, indicating the start of our data fetching process. We then call the pastFetch function, which should return a promise containing the data we want to lazy load. Once the promise resolves, we use the setData function to store the fetched data in our state. If the promise is rejected, we catch the error and use setError to update our error state with the encountered problem. And finally, regardless of the promise outcome, we set loading to false to signify that the fetching process has completed. The useEffect hook is dependent on the dependence array. Whenever a dependence value changes, the effect will rerun, fetching the data again. Our custom hook returns an object containing the data, loading, and error states, allowing any component using this hook to react to these values. And that wraps up our custom useLazyLoad hook. It cleanly abstracts the data fetching logic, making it reusable across different components in your Next.js app. Moving on, let's see how we can use our useLazyLoad hook within a React component. First, we import React. Next, we import the useLazyLoad hook from its file location. Here we have our component. Let's call it myComponent. We define it as a functional component. Well, use the useLazyLoad hook to fetch some data. You'll want to replace fetch data with your actual data fetching function. We invoke useLazyLoad, passing fetch data as an argument. We destructure the returned data, loading, and error for use in our component. In the component's render logic, if loading is true, we display a loading message to the user. If an error occurred during data fetching, we render a message displaying the error to the user. If there's no data, we return null, meaning we will not render anything until the data is available. Once the data is successfully fetched and provided it exists, we render our component with the relevant data attributes. Finally, we export myComponent to be used elsewhere in our Next.js app. This demonstrates how the useLazyLoad hook provides a clean and reusable solution for fetching data lazily in React components.